Yeah, no, I think both of you make really good points. I think that I disagree, actually, though, with both of you.
I literally just say things and your guys are like,
No, I agree.
I was like, I'm actually still not going to address your quote. And I'm going to go.
Neither of you addressed that text that I sent, that the ratio of Phil cuts to Ike cuts is like 6-1.
It's all right. Just chop my head off.
Let's go beyond the first page. Let's go beyond the first page.
Hello, second pagers, and welcome back to Beyond the First Page with siblings Phoebe, Isaac, and Phil. I'm Phoebe.
And I'm Isaac.
I'm Phil.
And this is Club Meeting 14, if you can believe it. Today we are talking about Lord of the Flies by William Golding. And before we get started, I just want to remind everybody that if you like this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Spotify, follow us on Instagram, and please feel free to leave us a comment and let us know anything you'd like us to talk about on any upcoming books. We also like to remind you that this is a podcast that is intended to be a virtual book club, and we meet every other Monday to discuss the book that we've agreed to discuss. We'll let you know what book we're reading next time at the end of this podcast. And if you don't want anything spoiled for you, we recommend that you read the book first and then listen to the podcast, only because there's major spoilers throughout this, and we're talking about the whole book with all of its major plot points. And so, again, if you don't want anything ruined for you, really recommend that you read the book first and then come on and listen to the podcast. So, with that all being said, I wanted to know, because this is Lord of the Flies, and we've probably have some listeners who have a bit of familiarity with the storyline of this since it is considered a classic, I wanted to start off our club meeting today by asking what you would bring to a deserted island. So 3 things that you could not live without on a deserted island.
I got mine. So I would bring a hatchet because it's a pretty good multi-tool, and the Hatchet by Gary Paulson proved that a young man can live with only a hatchet in the wilderness, and he was in the cold. So I already got that. Already got that step up by being on an island, preferably tropical. I guess we didn't technically say.
Yeah, I think, let's say for the sake of this, tropical.
Okay.
Similar to in the book.
I'm bringing flint and steel for a fire. I think the kids were had some pretty good ingenuity to use the eyeglasses to start a fire. It's hard for me to admit it. I don't think I would have thought of that quickly.
It also wouldn't have worked. I just want to say
it worked very easily for them. So yeah, flint and steel. And then I would bring a good, like, maybe 30-foot long, 1/2-inch thick rope. Just, you never know what you're going to need that for.
With the rope. Yeah, very smart. Phil, what would you bring to a deserted island?
So I think Isaac is spot on with the rope. I think we've come a little ways since flint and steel, so I would probably just bring a lighter. And then, honestly, probably fishing rod with a hook on the end. I'm questioning my ability to quickly make that effective. And after like 4 days of not eating, I think I would be screwed. I think I wouldn't be smart enough to really do anything. And so I think that easy source of food would be good. I think you could probably fashion a fishing rod, but I don't know if I could quickly enough. That would work.
I think that's great. What's your third thing?
Yeah. Fishing rod, lighter, and rope.
Oh, you're also doing rope. The rope is key. Okay, I would do, Isaac, I liked your literary reference, by the way, to tie it all into the podcast.
I'm trying.
I would do a crochet hook, a knife, and a book about plants, tropical plants. I think that would be my 3.
You obviously had a little bit more time to think about this.
Yeah. Well, the crochet hook, though, I think just like out of pure boredom, like they would give me something to do, but then I could also use, like palm fronds, and I could weave baskets. I could do different things. So that was I came up with that pretty quick. I think
you underestimate the amount of time it takes to find your own food. I think that's a full day endeavor.
I don't think you're
every
gonna have
day.
to be time. Yeah, you're gonna have to be start to
Yeah.
make socks because you've had enough time to make your own yarn.
You never know, though. You don't know how long you're going to be
That's
there.
true.
Because I think after a while, you could get really repetitive. You know the good hunting spot. You get the meat. You have your trap set. You just go around and collect
Yeah.
I think.
Not to elongate this conversation anymore, but I would have to think about substituting one of my items for just a water filter, like for fresh water until you find a
True.
good source.
Yeah.
So while I love the rope, I may be swapping
getting
the
rid of
rope
that.
out for water filtration.
I think you're a little tied to the hatchet. I don't
I
think
think
it
the
would
hatchet
cover it
is
as
very
effective.
handy for chopping down wood, killing things.
Different strokes for different folks.
Okay, so I picked this book, I think. Well, actually, this was a joint effort. Phil and I both, I think, decided we wanted to do this because it is it's a classic. I mean, a lot of people have probably read this in middle school or high school, and I had never read it. And so we wanted to. And then Isaac, you had read it at some point.
Yeah, I had read it, but I didn't remember the last probably third of it. So
Yeah, which was probably the most exciting part. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about Lord of the Flies?
Yep. So this
Isaac?
is The Lord of the Flies in 60 seconds or less. This book is about a group of boys stranded on an island without any adults. As the story unfolds, the boys look to create some sort of order and struggle with the duties of survival, how to get rescued, and how to govern themselves with no adults in charge.
Yeah, spot on. I think that our island question leads into the first topic that we kind of got into talking about, which would be different island scenarios. So if you listen to the book, which actually I recommend because William Golding reads it if you get a certain edition of it on Audible or Libby, and he talks about in the beginning this idea of having there's a reason he picked only boys, and maybe I misunderstood him, but essentially I think what he said was if this was girls, this wouldn't have happened. And so I picked boys because this was the most likely scenario that I thought would occur that would allow this story to occur. And it's interesting because I really agreed with him. And then talking to Phil, it sounds like, Phil, you don't agree with him and you think if it was all girls.
I think that the difference between men and women is less, I think, driven by the actual difference between men and women and more by what society has created already, and then men and women playing into that difference.
So what do you think about the Amazons though, Phil? Because that was my counter to you. But I know that's fake, but
the Amazons they have a
Yeah.
civilization already. Like, you're not taking something from the base. That's the thing that really drives this. And
I see what you're saying.
I think if they would have landed on a desert island and there would have been an established tribe there.
I think what you're saying though still I almost feel like you're contradicting yourself because you're saying women are conditioned to be a certain way, more docile, more harmonious. And so society has conditioned us, let's just say for the sake of this argument, into that. But so then if you are pulling, say present day, pulling 10 women onto the island, don't you think?
But you're not pulling 10 women. You're not pulling 10 women. You're pulling 10 undeveloped girls.
Yeah.
Like, I think that the roles women have played into are because women and men have set that. And frankly, men have set that out because, unfortunately, they've had the power dynamic for the last 6,000 years.
Yeah.
So they've sort of set out this role where they want the women to be more docile. And finally, over the last 100 years, they're countering that. But that's the role that they have, I think. Isaac, what do you think?
I think it would eventually end the same way. How they got there, we're speaking like if this were 26 years to 14-year-old girls. I do think there ends up being a power struggle. I mean, just think of middle school girls in the lunchroom. There is a power dynamic. There is, like, girls are being shooed off, and not to say that's not happening with boys too, but I don't necessarily think the physical aspects of the, like, let's go hunt meat and kill happens as quickly. After 2 days, they were out in the bush trying to stab things. These boys were.
Well, they're immediately naked, which I love. That was so fun. It was honestly an immediate descent into
Yeah.
freedom and savagery on some level.
I mean, there's nothing wrong with swimming naked. I don't necessarily think that's a that's a fall to savagery that quickly.
Not even a point for discussion, honestly.
But I do think eventually a girl in this scenario, a probably older, more physically capable girl, rises to the top, and anyone that tries to challenge her is put down.
Yeah.
Again, I think the author's point was like the male gender maybe just naturally goes to violence a little quicker, and that's where he wanted to do these boys. If it was girls, it would be I have to think a little bit more time in between there, where it was a lot more I don't want to say catty, but like psychological
Yes.
fighting versus
Psychological warfare.
them, jumping into the bush and then realizing, hey, we can stab a pig, we can stab a kid.
I think Isaac makes a good point. I think William Golding's better point was that he was a man, and so he has a little more to speak to that. And I think that's the stronger one, because I think Isaac and I are hypothesizing what happens when it's all girls in the room, and we don't really know. Phoebe does know, but she doesn't really know what happens when it's all guys in the room. And I will give you, it's gross.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. I will say, I think even, and I don't know if you meant this, Phil, I think even from a very young age, women are, so even these young women would which I think you're making that point, Isaac's making that point, they would be in some way conditioned, like girls are supposed to sit nicely and play, and boys are supposed to play in the dirt kind of thing. And I do think society is getting away from that. I'm just saying, as an overarching theme, I think we can all agree.
Yeah, no, it's still super prevalent.
So I think you guys are saying it would take more time for us to for women, I should say, to descend into chaos. And I do think, too, the little kids wouldn't be as neglected. It was very interesting to me how just the young kids were basically on their own. I think that wouldn't have happened. But I think your point is also very interesting about men who decided to be the leader. And I think, Isaac, you made a point about this too, in your notes at least, about how it's interesting how physically attractive or physically dominant people were put in charge, and how Piggy, even though he was obviously the smartest person, was not, and was laughed at and neglected because he was overweight. And just, I think that for me was a very salient point throughout this book that I think William Golden was trying to make.
Yeah, it was interesting that I guess I'd never really thought of that leadership aspect as a young kid, where he immediately writes, because Ralph was tall, good looking, and well built for a 12-year-old or 13-year-old, he naturally seemed like the person to be in charge. Because you hear about that with like politicians. Most politicians are good looking, but those are adults. So to hear that from, like, to think of that, okay, even kids are thinking that way.
Yeah.
Something I would like to kind of bring up is for another scenario is, do you think this same thing happens if they're 20 to 30 years old?
For sure.
No.
Oh, I think so. I don't know why. That was my visceral reaction to
And I'm trying to think of why I think not.
I think it's the same thing as Survivor or any, everybody on every level, exactly what you were just saying, Isaac, where kids are thinking this way, adults think this way. There is a natural leader. There's people who want power. I mean, you see it in a much more insidious way in every facet of our life and environment. And that's why I think this is our other topic of conversation, but just why this book has rang true throughout years and years. Because I think at any level that occurs, because you become desperate and there's pressure put on you, and there's this innate human nature to do these bad things, like kill people.
I think that this is actually a point that Golding is trying to get to and how he ends this book, where I sort of thought was stupid and then I thought about it a little bit more. And I think the adult comes in as a savior, and then the boys are fine. They like break down and stuff, but they're like, okay, let's go back into civilization. Let's adhere to the rules again.
Yeah.
And I think that he's sort of suggesting, okay, the adults can come in, but like, who's going to come in if this happens to adults? And who is the adult in civilization that can just sweep right in and everyone goes back to normal? And I think that is sort of what you're bringing up, Phoebe, of just this happens anyway. But I think that the boys had a couple of stop points that would have prevented this entire scenario had 2 or 3 people been like, what the hell is Jack doing right now? And I just think that with 20 to 30-year-olds, I think, well, one, it's definitely personalities. If you get a docile enough group, then no. But I'm just thinking you have a little bit of individuality. I don't think it becomes as obvious. And this is also like a 1950s Britain thing where obviously the fat kid was like, let's call him Piggy. And I just think there's a little pomp to that. And that's maybe just British. But
I think like
that,
people
like,
do that. We're really mean. Humans are cruel.
I don't think nobody learns the kid's name and everyone calls him Piggy. If you have 30, 20-year-olds,
Yeah.
I
Wait,
will
Isaac,
say
so
that.
is it 30, 20-year-olds all men?
Yes. Yeah. So 20 to 30 years of age, 20 of them, all men. Yeah.
Yeah, my answer definitely stands then. I think if it's women, that's a little different, but like women and men together.
Well, yeah, that's a completely different conversation.
Well, what do you think, Isaac?
So I do think that there is a similar trajectory. I
Descent.
think that the Piggy character gets a lot more credence paid to him, and there is like a lot more natural organization. And I think there is always going to be a power struggle no matter what age. But I like what Phil said. I think that the Ralph character much more quickly goes to Jack and be like, yeah, man, go do your own thing. The people here that want to do this are going to do this. We're going to keep this fire lit. We're going to collect water and we're going to try to be rescued. If you want to go hunt, that's totally cool.
Good for you.
If you need some fire, let us know. Don't like, we're not here to compete. I'm not going to try to compete with you. Go do your own thing.
Right. Yeah.
I think that's easy to say, sitting in my living room and not stranded on the desert island with a psychopath.
Yeah.
But I think that if you have a Jack character, it doesn't matter what age, that character is going to seek power and go off the deep end, and who knows what they're capable of.
Yeah.
You're right.
Yeah. When there is no,
Yeah.
when he realizes, wow, there is nothing here to like keep me in check. There's social norms that we have brought, and that's it.
Yeah. What other
So.
scenarios, Isaac, were you thinking?
I mean, that was the main one. And then you could talk about,
Yeah.
Girls and boys of that younger age group too. The author in his like preamble talks about the sexual tension that would be created probably with the teenagers.
Yeah. I think one thing that I want to bring a little bit back, and I'm sorry for taking our podcasters through a loop here, is Isaac made a very strong point about how Ralph might be like, hey, dude, if you want to do this, like, go over. I think until the last 5 pages, Ralph was a jerk, dude. Ralph was not like that. Ralph was the second worst choice for a leader, in my opinion. I mean, he started the book, and everyone sort of knows that in Lord of the Flies, like, descends into madness. I've never read the book. I just knew that. And I thought Ralph was going to be the descendant. I mean, Piggy tells him, hey, don't tell everyone that they call me Piggy. And he's like, nah, here's everyone. Like, he's a jerk, dude. He's the worst.
I think he was just a kid, though. I don't
yeah.
think he was I don't think any of these kids were actually bad people or psychopaths. I think they were just a product of their environment. But I think Ralph was just also, I think when they talk about the curtain, that's his anxiety, where he's so stressed about the situation, he forgets what his train of thought because he's so stressed. I think he's just a kid that all kids are cruel. Like we've all said things that we wish we hadn't said, but I think on the whole, that doesn't make us bad people.
I disagree. I think if your initial reaction to meeting stranded on an island another kid and just disregarding him and not asking him his name, making fun of him because of his asthma, just when it's just you two,
Yeah.
that's psychotic.
Yeah, that is mean. You're right.
My point was that I don't think that happens if it's adult. Like, I don't think that happens.
Yeah.
I think you're right. I just wanted to bring up that the Ralph character development he was a completely changed character by the end.
Yeah, actually, I had a quote. I'll read it now because ties along with your point, Phil. Just give me a moment here. I've got my book. His voice rose under the black smoke before the burning wreckage of the island, and infected by that emotion, the other little boys began to shake and sob too. And in the middle of them, with the filthy body, matted hair, and unwiped nose, Ralph wept for the end of innocence, the darkness of man's heart, and the fall through the air of the true, wise friend called Piggy. So at the end, he does feel sad about Piggy. He grew up a little bit there. And the end of innocence, which was sad.
No, Phoebe, I really like that quote. That's something you wouldn't get. That quote you wouldn't get at the end of a Kristen Hanna book, right? So that I think is a really good transition into why is this book a classic? Why has Isaac read it before? And why does most middle schoolers read this book? So what do you guys think?
I think it's because you can, and we talked about this actually a little bit on the last podcast because I was reading this. It's what the most important thing he says in his postscript, if you listen from the author, the most important thing of what the book is about is what the reader gets from it. It's not what the author thinks it's about. It's not what a class tells you the book is about or what you're supposed to get out. It's what the reader gets out of it. And I think as this is a classic, there are a lot of messages in there that could be pulled that stand the test of time, will always be a evaluation of or an examination of human beings. So it could be, a thought experiment on society, a thought experiment on man's natural base level. I think it is a classic because you're always going to be able to discuss those kind of things, and you're always going to be able to have a discussion like we just had about those topics.
Yeah.
I personally think it's about it's a story or a message about power and the constant seeking of it by human beings, that and no matter what kind of scenario you're put in, there is going to be some sort of power struggle. Even in and if you think about your everyday life, almost everything you do is there's like a give and take. And that could be considered a power struggle in anything that you're doing. And then this book is just an analysis of that from a fictional standpoint of a level of human beings that are not quite developed to understand or just haven't been experienced enough life to keep it in check. And so that explores kind of like the basic human level of the power struggle.
So overall, you would say the power struggle and power dynamic and power in general is what Lord of the Flies is about.
Yeah. And one of the reasons why it's a classic, because people can sit here 70 years after it was written and still talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah, completely agree. I know. I like that you said that, Isaac, because I think I gleaned a very different meaning than most people got out of it, just because I think there was things in it that spoke to me in this moment, like just things that I feel like resonated with me. And this is actually another quote that I got that I wanted to share with you guys. And this is kind of what the meaning I took from this book was about. This is when Jack and Ralph are starting to get into it because Ralph is going hunting all the time Jack is going hunting all the time and Ralph is stuck making the structures. And this is the excerpt. And I work all day with nothing but Simon, and you come back and don't even notice the huts. I was working too, but you like it, shouted Ralph. You want to hunt, while they face each other on the bright beach, astonished at the rubbing feeling. And then it goes on to say, they walked along 2 continents of experience and feeling, unable to communicate. If I could only get a pig, I'll come back and go on with the shelter. They looked at each other, baffled in love and hate. All the warm salt water of the bathing pool and the shouting and splashing and laughing were only just sufficient to bring them together again. I think to me, that passage showed just the like give and take of a relationship. Exactly like you're saying, there's a give and take, Isaac. And this is a power struggle in its own way, but it's also coming from a place of understanding and seeing that, you know, the two sides were trying to bring together this group of people, I think, at least at the beginning. One was trying to hunt in the way that he saw, the one was trying to build the shelter in the way that he saw was best. And so to me, that just really resonated because this resentment is starting to build, and it could have really been avoided because they were both valuable in that moment. There were shelters that needed to be built, and there was hunting that needed to happen because everyone needed to eat. But because of just miscommunication and obviously, you know, just the forces of stress and nature and everything, it didn't end that way. But it could have been harmonious, I think. Just a lesson of that. And then the other thing I took was this mask effect. So when Jack put on the mask, that was the first time he killed a pig, and then he slowly descended into savagery and was wearing the mask constantly. And it reminded me of social media, which again, I think is why this book is a classic, because even in today's day and age, at the time it was written, there was no such thing as the internet or computers or anything or social media. But I was able to compare that to social media because it's like people hide behind this facade or this computer, and they can say what they want and do what they want and say things they would never normally say to someone's face. And that's what the mask represented to me. So those two different things to me is why it showed exactly like you're saying, the complexity of human nature, Isaac, and it's really showing that, and it stands the test of time. So those are the two meanings, and that's why I think it's a classic, at least for me.
Yeah, no, I think both of you make really good points. I think that I disagree, actually, though, with both of you.
Phil, we
I
just
think
said
that
it's
you're
only what you take away. It doesn't have to be a
no,
disagreement.
I don't. No, I mean, the question is why it's a classic. That's the question. You can take away whatever you want, but there is an answer to the why it's a classic. Yeah, you take away that for sure. But the question is, why is it a classic? I agree with your takeaway.
Just say why you think it's a classic.
I'm just saying, there's a yes or no for this one. No, I just think that your points I think you guys are just missing that that is a qualification for a classic. First and foremost, yes, it needs to stand the test of time. It needs to be able to be interpreted, like you said, Phoebe, of just like what you can take away from it. And that needs to be more diverse than simple meaning, just one simple meaning. I think that is definitely a classic needs that. But I think if there's anything our podcast has proven, it's that we can talk about any book for an hour and all have different takeaways. And this is probably our first classic. I think the Casual Vacancy, like that, we could have millions of takeaways from that. I don't think that will go in time as a classic. But I think that what makes this, and I did a little bit of research on this because I think it was such a good question from Isaac, what makes a classic? And Phoebe, you mentioned this too, because it's like the first that did this. And I do think that that's really why this one is really solidified, because it was actually the first one. It was responding to sort of this 1850s book that was written where three boys got stranded on an island, and it was like la-di-da, like peace. Like it was sort of like a Hatchet, but with 3 boys. It was them discovering how they would survive, and everything was great. And then you have the Robinson Crusoe and the Swiss Family Robinson, where everything's fine. And then this guy takes the exact opposite. And it was just so abrasive for the common narrative, but also everyone was like, he's got a point. And so I do think for the classic, you do need some of that novelty it has to have more than just these very diverse takeaways. I think you get even like Shakespeare, what he was doing. Shakespeare written today, and I'm not a Shakespeare fan, so this is might come across a little harsh, but I think Shakespeare written today would go under the water, like it would be missed. But he was the first, like Hamlet was the first true revenge story.
But Isaac's point about, I mean, Isaac brings up, and sorry to steal your thunder, Isaac, so I guess I do disagree with you, Phil, even though I just said it's not a disagreement. But
there you go.
I do.
So I'm at least right about that.
Yeah, you were right about that. Isaac brings up the fact that like Animal Farm, I think, is exactly the same concept as this. And that was written 10 years previously to this book.
That is a completely different book.
I think it's very much the
Animal
same.
Farm is a complete allegory about the Russian Revolution.
I know, but the concepts are the
it
same. Like they end up eating their own.
No, this was let's take all civilization away from boys and have human beings be very legit. That was a rebellion against a higher, like,
Okay, maybe I'm forgetting.
I mean,
I
no,
think they're in the
it's
same
very
vein of like the same kind of topic, or saying, you know, you would have similar discussions about humanity,
human cruelty.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
I agree with Phil. Like it's a different. It's a
Different
similar
genre.
thought
I think it's a
experiment
different
from a
vibe.
very different starting point.
Yeah. I think like looking up what you said too, just quickly looking up why it's a classic, the relevancy over time is a huge factor of that. And you're saying that, and I do agree with you. I think, you know, Shakespeare was revolutionary because of what he was doing at the time. Being first is important in a lot of this stuff. So definitely agree with you. I think also the writing itself was very good, which probably is important to a classic. I thought his imagery.
Oh, that's interesting you say that. I think I agree. There was a lot of, when I was looking this up, there was a lot of complaints about how it was very narrative driven. There was not a lot of prose or elegance.
But it was very
this happened,
descriptive, which
No, I
yeah.
loved it. I thought it was very good, but it wasn't, there was no flowery
Yeah, it wasn't
language.
beautiful, but it was,
Right.
I think it was almost like you were reading a bedtime story to a kid. Because it was like the pa-chow and the ka-chow. Like they do the different voice.
Yeah.
I think it was intended for kids, almost. That's not fully
not
fleshed out
sure.
in my
I
brain,
mean,
but
I think I read it in
Yeah.
early high school or late middle school, so young adult.
yeah.
I mean, I think the one thing we're also just discounting a little bit is just the randomness of some guy in the 1960s put this into the American education system, and they've been reading it
Yeah,
since.
that's
Like
very
it's
true.
a lot easier to read Lord of the Flies next year instead of go and find a different book.
I think that
tells the
helps
same
make a
thing.
classic.
Like,
You know, that
Yeah.
like art, kind of like what
Human
Yeah,
complacency?
what like all of a sudden this art that someone looked at that had some credentials said, you know, this is a good painting, and then it's
So
good.
true.
dare I say that is not helping making a classic. I'd say that is the most important thing.
Yeah.
Is the
The
randomness.
random, yeah.
Dave.
Yeah. So with all that being said, what would you guys give it? What rating would you give it? And Phil, would you just explain our rating system for anyone who's new?
Yeah, so our rating system is a little easier for regular novels, but it's a Michelin star. So 3 stars is exceptional. I would read this book again. 2 stars is a pretty darn good book, and I would feel that I could recommend this to other people and be confident about it. 1 is decent book, nothing really special, and then 0 is like a bad book.
Okay. And Phil, what did you
I
think?
would give it I actually gave it a 1. There are better books about relationships. The one thing I really didn't like is that it felt like I was in middle school, and after every chapter could break and do a discussion of what does this pig head talking to this mean? Maybe, and it's because I read 1984 in that style, when it's so similar. There's a lot of foreshadowing.
Right.
They literally call him Piggy, and then they hunt pigs, and then they like them beating up Roger. A lot of it seemed a little forced to me for that element of group discussion, but it was fine.
What about you, Isaac?
So I gave it 2. I think I share Phil's sentiment in most things. I gave it a 2 because of the conversation we just had of it being a classic and just of a book that, if you want to talk about books, read this book and you'll be able to talk about it with most people or something and have a pretty decent conversation.
Right.
So as someone who you're just like, I need a book to read Lord of the Flies. Probably someone you're going to run into has also read it and you can have a pretty good combo.
Yeah. Yeah, I also gave it a 2. Again, I would just echo both of what you said. Probably trying a little too hard, but I would agree with Isaac. I think it was good enough that I would recommend it to somebody else because it is a classic. So I'm curious what you guys, if people liked Lord of the Flies, what book that you would recommend that they read? And Isaac, would you like to share that?
So I had Animal Farm in 1984, both mentioned earlier in this by George
Sorry.
Orwell. But yes, I think similar thought experiments to this book, I believe, written around the same time. And also kind of in that same vein of, reading it in late middle school or early high school. So maybe that's also why I immediately thought of both these.
Yeah. What about you, Phil?
Yeah, so I think mine are both hitting on the same vein as Isaac of just sort of same feel and also written around the same time. The first one is Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. It's just a really psychological. A lot of things are like imagined threats, and you don't really know when things are real or not, like when Simon is talking to the head or like the whole beast concept. And then the other one is probably Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, who it's a very similar to what Isaac said with 1984, sort of thought experiment written about the same time, I believe.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, mine is also The Most Dangerous Game by Richard Connell. Again, it's probably something you've read in middle school. But then I also wanted to recommend Washington Black by Essie Adugan. And this is a story about an enslaved man who tries to get his freedom and his adventures with this man who has taken him on as a manservant. And the man is a naturalist, so they go all over the world. And I don't know why it necessarily spoke to me that they would be similar. I just think this is a great book. Highly recommend it to our listeners if you haven't read it. And I think there's a poignancy of message throughout the book that rings true, and not the same message, but a similar poignancy from both books. So would recommend Washington Black if you haven't read it yet. And then I'm also wondering what you guys are reading right now. So Phil, do you want to share what you're currently reading or a book that you just read that you loved?
So I'm currently reading Tom Lake by Anne Pratchett.
How's it going?
I don't love it, actually. Moron, big fan. I think I think I need just a fantasy kick because I've just read too many slow books back to back. I think I would like it in a different frame of
It's slower.
mind. And then I just finished this book called White Holes, which is this book about physics. And it's like a physics and philosophical book, pretty accessible. I thought it was just really, really good, actually.
Cool. Isaac, what are you reading?
I'm reading the second book in the Farseer trilogy, so The Royal Assassin by Robin Hobb. It's excellent so
Nice.
far. Really enjoying it. And then I actually think a lot about, I think if you like this book, if you read The Ranger's Apprentice, it's a young adult novel. So if some of our listeners have read that more in their teen years, they would really like this series.
Yeah, that's a great comparison, I think. I just finished Familiar by Lee Bardugo, and she wrote The Ninth House. So I would recommend, if you liked The Ninth House, I recommend that you read Familiar. Or if you like this Scholar Mance series by Naomi Novak, you would also like Familiar. It was pretty good. I did not like The Ninth House that much. I thought that Familiar was better than The Ninth House. So, and then this is going to bring us to a close of our.
Yeah, well, one thing I want to get at before we went to a close, I just think it would be a little bit remiss if we didn't mention the fact that I do think there's a lot of more implicit, but still pretty explicit racism and a little bit of colonialism written into this book. But I didn't want to just let it be unsaid, but I do think that there's a denoting that natives were savages. And I don't think that should be ignored, but I also think that we can still get a lot of out of this book with just thinking that savages are not natives. Savages are people without rules. And unfortunately, English sort of equated both of them to the same thing. And that was just ignorance on their part. But I just wanted to recognize that in the book.
So glad you mentioned that, Phil. I definitely think we would be remiss to not mention it. And I think just before we go, I wanted to let our listeners know what we'll be reading 2 weeks from now on the 15th of July, and that would be Beloved by Toni Morrison. Another what we would consider a classic probably. And Isaac, would you mind sharing just a little bit about Beloved?
Of course. Beloved is a story about an escaped enslaved woman in her haunted past. The ghost of Sethi's dead daughter, known as Beloved, returns to haunt her, and the novel delves into the impact of slavery on individuals and communities.
Great. I'm very excited to read Beloved. I have never read that. Isaac, have you read it?
No.
Okay, good. Yeah, so we're all three reading this for the first time. I think it's definitely something we should read. So very excited that we will be doing that. And with that, this is a bi-weekly reminder that you should call someone that you love. Hopefully it could be your sibling, if not a friend or just anybody, and tell them about a good book that you just read, or if you just read Lord of the Flies, you can tell them about that. And we hope that you have a chance to visit your local library or use your Libby app and read a really good book. Until we talk again, stay classy, second pagers. We'll talk to you later.
See you guys.
Bye, guys.
Let's go beyond.